Right, my name is Brian Gerrish. Until 1993, I was a naval officer. I find it quite amusing to be stood here under the man at the top on this column, and I wonder what he would think of our society today. I'd like to thank the organisers of this event because it's brought a very good group of people together, and what has been fascinating was to see all the different styles. So we've had people who've been victims, we've had people who've produced books, but everybody wants to get a message out. And what I'd like to do is try and draw some of the things together that we haven't spoken about yet. And the first message which I'd like to get across to you is that if we are going to do something to stop the abuse of children, we have to understand that it is our government system and it is our public sector that is helping to sustain and promote the abuse. I'd just like to give you a couple of words about how I got interested in this subject. If I go back about 8-9 years ago, I was living in Plymouth and I began to understand with other people in that city the very large amounts of public money were going missing. Taxpayers' valuable money was disappearing into people's pockets, millions of pounds. And it was being done by dividing up the money into small packets and filtering it into small organisations and charities. And we decided to do something about it. We decided to talk about it, and we produced a small newspaper. Well, that newspaper grew, and it became this one, which some of you have got a copy. It's called the UK Column. It's all produced by volunteers. And Mike Robinson, who's with me today, has done the lion's share on this newspaper. But we tried to do something simple, which is actually to tell the truth about what was going on. When we did that, something very interesting happened. We started to get threatened. The weather's a bit threatening, so I'm going to keep going. But basically, as we tried to get the truth out about fraud and corruption, so the threats and intimidation started. And what was interesting is those threats and intimidation came from within the establishment. It wasn't to do with ordinary individuals. As we printed a few more papers, people came to us with amazing stories about what was happening to their children. Mothers and fathers would come to us and tell us that their children were being taken by the authorities, by social services, under false pretenses. And initially, I can assure you, I didn't believe everything I was told. But one day, a lady came to see me with 4 big bundles of documents. And she proved to me very, very quickly that her child, her daughter, had been taken away with absolutely no lawful documentation to support that action. And what's more, over 10 years later, she's never seen her daughter again. Now, some of you might be wondering how this could happen. And I'd say to you that you can only understand how it can happen when you start to talk to some of the victims. Thank you very much. Because the victims will tell you the truth. They will tell you how they were in a court where, of course, there was no jury. There were no members of the public. There was no press. So there was only the victim faced with the local authority and their barristers and their legal team and social services. And the victims will tell you about perjury being committed in those courts. Absolute lies and fabrication told by local authorities and social services. And maybe there's somebody out there who's thinking, but I've got a friend called Janet who works in social services, and she's a very nice lady. And she wouldn't do something like that. And I will say to you, I'm sure you're correct, because most people are good. But because most people are good, it doesn't mean that we don't have evil people amongst us, the sort of people who will lie and cheat and steal. And perhaps I can give you no better example than that, than our own MPs. Because at the moment, as far as I'm aware, not one of them has actually been successfully prosecuted for thieving expenses. Am I correct? I believe I am. So the people we've got in Westminster, the people who have been elected to maintain law and order, many of them are themselves criminals, thieves, liars. And therefore it's no surprise to me that you can have a court system or a social services system with people of that ilk. Now, the important thing is the secret court system. I know that there's a lot of visitors from overseas here today. I met a lady from Lithuania earlier on. We've got Russians, we've got Poles, we've got Germans. At the moment, people think they live in a democracy. But I'm going to say to you that it's far from true, because at the moment we have secret family courts operating in which there is no jury. The court cases are not reported by the mainstream press. Why? Because invariably there is a gagging order put on. And the mainstream papers, The Guardian, The Telegraph, The Mail, The Express, they run away like frightened children because somebody's told them they can't print the truth. Well, we started printing the truth in the UK column, and something extraordinary happened, and that was the telephone began to ring. And each time the telephone rang, we had another family giving us another story about their children being taken away. And then we started to learn that many of the children taken away by social services were actually being abused within the care system itself. How can this happen? Well, the main reason it can happen is because when people stand up and try and tell the truth, they're gagged. This small volunteer newspaper has received 4 injunctions for trying to tell the truth about child snatch cases. The mainstream papers, some of the reporters will talk about it. Christopher Booker's been quite brave recently. Well done, Mr. Booker. But many of them just will not print the stories because they are frightened of injunctions from the family courts. Now, I'll ask you a question. What happens when you have a secret family court where there's no jury, there's no press reporting, and the judge is a paedophile? If you think that judges aren't paedophiles, I'll assure you some of them are, just the same as some policemen, some public sector people. At the moment, the newspapers would have us believe that the only perpetrators of these horrible crimes are dirty old men in raincoats. And that is absolutely not true. It is a section through society, and it is blatantly obvious from the evidence being put in front of us that politicians, senior judges, senior barristers, police officers, local authority chief executives, head of social service units are themselves practicing paedophiles. And in this environment, since the truth cannot be published, their crimes can be done in the dark. Now, this government system we have at the moment, don't be fooled into thinking because David Cameron has suddenly come into office that everything's going to change. Because exactly the same people are going to keep their thumbs on the NHS and the social service system as was happening under Mr. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. They do not want the lid to come off social services and childcare because they know their own colleagues are going to be implicated. There's a picture out at the moment which shows David Cameron standing next to a paedophile called Matthew Byrne. It's on the internet, look it up. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that Mr. Cameron knew he was a paedophile at the time, but it is interesting that paedophiles can move up through the social system. I will also add, you may like to know that Mr. Matthew Byrne, paedophile, was also a Common Purpose Advisory Board member. And if you don't know what Common Purpose is, I suggest you find out very quickly, because it's working very hard to alter our views of society. Why should I talk about altering views of society?